theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
Welcome to The Dangerous Maybe. I'm Michael Downs. In this episode, I'm joined by Matthew Flisfeder to discuss his new book, The Hysterical Sublime. In it, Matthew makes many important connections between capitalism, posthumanism, accelerationism, and subjectivity, just to name a few. I believe this book will prove to be a major, lasting contribution to theory. I'll be interviewing Matthew with Nance, and I'm happy to announce that Nance and I just had the first essay we've co-authored together published in Everyday Analysis. The essay is called Enjoy Your Surveillance on Superegoic Capitalistic Artificial Intelligence. I would also like to let you know that I am going to be teaching a course in October at Cadell Last's Philosophy Portal. The course is titled Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and Technological Singularity. I would love to have you join, and if you would like to sign up, head over to my Patreon. There is a post devoted to the course, and all you have to do to sign up is purchase that post, and it automatically registers you in the course. I'll leave a Patreon link in the description for those of you interested in joining. One last thing before we get started. I recently had the privilege of joining Micheal from Žižek So On and Todd McGowan for 2 interviews with Todd about his latest book, The Cambridge Introduction to Jacques Lacan. Those interviews were a total blast. Go check them out over at Žižek So On. And now, without any further ado, let's start the show. All right, everybody. Welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. We are here with a special guest to talk about his new book. Matthew Flisfeder has joined us to discuss The Hysterical Sublime, Humanism in the Age of Posthuman Capitalism, which just came out this week. So, Matt, congrats on the new book. It's awesome that it's out. We are very excited to talk to you about it. You are definitely discussing topics that are close to our hearts. And so, yeah, it's great to have you here to talk about your book.
No, I'm excited to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys.
Awesome. Nance, what are you thinking?
I think this book is one of the few that I hope makes it out of the near future. And there are a lot of books, and there are more books coming out every day. And a lot of them are really, really good. But I really do think there's something special in this book. I think, Matthew, you're getting at, as I like to say, like the object at the end of history, or the object standing in the way of this project of being humans, or whatever it is we are trying to do. And I don't think anybody knows exactly what that is. I kind of reject all the hard claims. But it's also undeniable we're trying to do something. And we're trying to defend the right to be humans in the face of this kind of post-humanizing, not just ideology, but like totalizing condition that we're all kind of stuck in. And it can feel like we don't really have a chance, or we don't have a choice. So I think this book is an instant classic.
Yeah, I totally disagree, but thanks for saying that.
So, okay. Well, first off, some context. So, Matthew, what inspired you to write this book and to focus on this subject in particular?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So I thought of this. I mean, there's a couple of things. So one, I had a couple of books ago, I wrote a book called Postmodern Theory and Blade Runner. And that was in a series that Todd McGowan He was the editor. I think Ryan Engley took over editing that series. But in that series, it's basically half the book is the explanation of a theory or a theorist, and then the second half is an analysis of a film. So I wrote about postmodernism, postmodern theory, and one of my all-time favorite movies, Blade Runner. But when I was writing that, I was very inspired, of course, by Frederick Jameson's interpretation of postmodernism. It's been that his work on postmodernism and his work in general have always been a favorite of mine. I feel very influenced by his writing, but he has in the original essay. Postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism, and then it's later the first chapter of the book of the same name. He has this little section where he's talking about this idea of hysterical sublime, and when I've read the work, it's that term has always kind of stuck with me. Wondering, and Jameson never really develops it anywhere else other than in that piece, and it's always kind of I've wondered, what else could be done with it. What does he mean by it? But of course, the flip side of it too is a lot of Slavoj Žižek's work. His first book in French, Le plus sublime des hystériques, the most sublime hysteric, which comes from a line from Lacan. Lacan refers to, I think it's in Seminar 17, Lacan refers to Hegel as the most sublime hysteric. And along with the Zizek's first book in English, The Sublime Object of Ideology, these terms, hysterical and hysteric, sublime, they've always kind of stuck with me. So I was really eager to try to think about where that concept could go. I first used it to write a piece about the TV series Black Mirror. And I can get into some of the meaning of the term in a second. But I wrote about Black Mirror with this concept, and I was not in a couple of other pieces I was playing around with it. But then the other sort of thing that happened was when I was working on my last book, Algorithmic Desire, I had been starting to write. I initially started my work writing about psychoanalysis, Marxism, and film. But then over time, I switched into writing about social media, I guess around 2012-ish. And I'd always wanted to do a piece sort of taking on the way that somebody like Jodi Dean conceptualized communicative capitalism, her interpretation of what she calls the decline of symbolic efficiency. And that was sort of the initial inspiration for writing that book. But in the course of working on it, again, in the 2010s, there was a lot of attention to concepts like new materialism, and posthumanism was getting it was a resurgence of it. There was versions of it in the 1990s with the CCRU, but also of course people like Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales. But then there was like this revival of it in the 2010s, and through Žižek's critique of new materialisms specifically, I started thinking about, and another inspiration was, and I read about this in Algorithmic Desire, this idea that the Ljubljana Lacanians are kind of rewriting Louis Althusser's theory of structural causality. So I started thinking that I aligned a little bit more with thinking about a reincarnation or a new version of structuralism. So I ended up working on the book to develop a theory of what I called at the time a new structuralism, and that was really as an attempt to try to grapple with some of the new materialist post-humanist theories that were coming out around then. But I didn't ultimately feel satisfied in Algorithmic Desire with the way that I was talking about new materialism and post-humanism, and I felt that I could spend a little bit more time trying to get into what I saw as problematic in that work. And it occurred to me at a certain point that when I was talking about with the Ljubljana school as a new structuralism, by which it kind of meant that it was like thinking about structures with a gap or a lack, at which point we see the presence of the subject. And because the category of subject was such a target for a lot of the French structuralism in the 1960s, 1970s, which they associated with humanism, it kind of occurred to me that what I was really doing was trying to rethink a concept of not the human as such, but humanism as a philosophy, as a project, as a movement. So these things all kind of came together when I was thinking about how to conceive the hysterical sublime. I wanted to think about this concept that Jameson came up with, and I had thoughts about how to connect it to what I see as the transition from what I referred to as a new structuralism into trying to produce a new way of thinking about humanism.
Awesome. Great. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, I think the two questions that come to mind now are more, can you get into more of what you think of the meaning of hysterical sublime versus different types of the sublime? What makes it specifically hysterical? And then to follow up on that, you start off the book by saying this is not a book about Marxist humanism. So the question would be, what type of humanism do you defend in this book?
Okay, good. Thanks for those questions. So I'll start with Jameson, the way Jameson uses this term hysterical sublime. So he begins by contrasting postmodernism with modernism, romanticism. Mostly with romanticism, he talks about the way in which the concept of the sublime was developed in the works of Edmund Burke and, of course, later Immanuel Kant. And to be a bit reductive, he kind of explains that the sublime in the romantic notion of the sublime and in early and late modernism is this idea of positing, in some way, the presence of external nature as something that is threatening, harmful, to the human, to humanity, but at the same time as there is this external nature that is threatening, we still feel this awe and fascination and fear about the potential harms or threats from external nature. One of the ways that Edmund Burke talks about it, for instance, is that when we experience the irrationality of external nature from a distance, then we can take pleasure from it. We can enjoy it in a certain way. And Kant kind of picks up on that, and he develops it in a way that, as I read Kant, and again, I'm sure there are many who disagree with the interpretation that I have of it, but I kind of see what Kant doing when he's when in his third critique of judgment, aesthetic judgment, in talking about what aesthetic judgment as something that is subjective. We're talking about, what do we consider to be beautiful, right? When we consider it to be beautiful, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, of course, right? So how do you account for how do you try to create objective criteria for measuring and judging something that is largely subjective? And the way I see him doing that is positing the category of the sublime as something like a presupposition that we need to put into place. In a way, it's putting the human subject into the frame in a certain way that sets the marker against which we can then make universal judgments on art and beauty. So for Jameson, thinking about the sublime as it's developed in romanticism and in modernism, it's very much about the human relationship to external nature. But according to him, in postmodernism, there's this shift that takes place where it's no longer a question of positing external nature against human perceptions, but it's about the relationship between, we start to perceive not nature, but the development of advanced technology and the conditions of late capitalism as the other against which we feel this fear and awe and anxiety and passion against this, because it's perceived that it's technology itself that can as opposed to nature that can come and to destroy us and wreak havoc upon us in a different way. Now, the way that Jameson then reads it, he argues that this idea of what he calls a hysterical sublime as the fear and awe of technology is really a substitute unconsciously for our fear and fascination with the capitalist mode of production. So he uses it in that way to talk about how the aesthetics of postmodernism, with a focus on the development of technology, create this sensation around the fear and fascination that we feel about late-stage capitalism. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how, in a lot of what also has developed in parallel with the discourses around new materialism and posthumanism, is this environmental and geological concept of the Anthropocene. This idea that Anthropocene as a proposed new geological period, where it's argued that human civilization has, for the first time in Earth's very long history, had an impact on the geological formation of the planet. And there's many different people who have different ways of dating the beginning of the Anthropocene. I think that one of the more popular datings is to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is where I prefer to date what people are calling the Anthropocene, and I'll say why in a second. Some people think about it what's called the Great Acceleration in the post-war period, with the rise of consumer culture, consumer society. Somebody like even the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari dates the Anthropocene all the way back to the dawn of man some 70,000 years ago, and considers that the birth of humanity in its contemporary form, the birth of Homo sapiens even, is the beginning of this period of the Anthropocene. But it started to occur to me when we're talking about the Anthropocene and this human geological transformation to Earth, a lot of it has to do with the way that humanity has developed different technologies. That it's the technologies that humanity develops that have had an impact on on culture, society, the formation of the Earth. And it started to occur to me that what Jameson was describing as a fear and fascination with technology, yes, I think it's a substitute for fear and fascination with capitalism, but I also think that it's become this fear of humanity, that humanity has become the target of this idea of a hysterical sublime. And I'll just say, too, that I think that I agree with I think he's an environmental or ecologist, Marxist scholar, Jason W. Moore. He talks about not an Anthropocene, but a capitalocene. And he does this in an important way, because it is a way to focus not on geological formation or environmental degradation as the byproduct of collective humanity, but to recognize that global humanity is divided, split by antagonisms, by political struggle, by the class struggle, by various different forms of exploitation and inequities that exist, so that to displace everything back onto collective humanity is pulling attention away from the kinds of power imbalances that exist as a result of the capitalist mode of production. So what I try to do is take this concept of the hysterical sublime that Jameson develops in contrast to the sublime of romanticism, modernism, think about how it's supposed to represent this fear and fascination of and anxiety towards technology that in our current times it gets displaced onto collective humanity as such, and that in order to theorize the post-human, there's this need to take the human as such as this sublime other against which it can develop its own argumentation around how to conceive posthumanism. And I may want to talk a little bit about some of the different types of posthumanism and how they differ from each other, but we can get into that in a second, because I also want to say that the other way that I wanted to think about hysterical sublime was then to take that aspect, ask why did Jameson call it hysterical? Because he could have easily called it the technological sublime when he was talking about the concept in postmodern conditions. So it was important to me to think about whether or not the description of the hysterical was an accurate way to talk about the problem that I was considering, and moving from Jameson to my own interest. And I think that it's appropriate for a couple of reasons to refer to this as a hysterical sublime. One, in a Lacanian sense, because I think that the hysteric, as people like, beyond Lacan, but even Mladen Dolar and Slavoj Žižek, in different ways, have talked about how the hysteric is the subject as such. That part of what identifies the hysteric is a form of failed interpolation. And what I wanted to do was to, against not just traditional structuralism or post-structuralism as it's influenced different forms of new materialisms and post-humanisms, but I wanted to bring back together the concept of the subject and the idea of a humanism as a political ideology or philosophy or movement, however you want to put it, and to say that hysterical sublime is not just the fear and fascination with the damages of the human, but that it's necessary to take ownership of that, not to fear it, but to take ownership of it and take pride in our hysteria, take pride in our neurosis, take pride in our sticking out, even in a way that allows us to perceive what is dehumanizing in the capitalist mode of production.
It's really good. Well, before Nance, you got anything you want to add or ask, or?
I don't think there's much to add to that, other than the fact that it is implicating the reader, the audience, or whatever, and showing us, no, this is a political project. And I think a lot of the other political projects that have dealt with this fear and or fascination have failed, and we turn to high-minded, bleeding heart programs that are themselves dehumanizing in various ways. And I just think you kind of expertly do this move to show us that, no, we're always already here, and we have to do something where we find ourselves. We can't, pretend we're already on some shining city on some shining hill. We're in the muck, and we must rake some of this muck. And I think that's what the world needs right now at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree with you very much. And if I could just jump in on that point, because Mikey, you asked me before also why I start the preface of the book by saying that it's not a book about Marxist humanism.
Yeah.
So I was very conscientious about the fact that because I'm somebody who has been influenced by the work of Slavoj Žižek, who has been himself influenced by somebody like Louis Althusser, who very famously presents his philosophy as a theoretical anti-humanism, and that's something that Žižek latched onto from very early on, I think, in his youth. It was important to me to take Althusser's theoretical anti-humanism seriously for those reasons. At the same time that I felt that the way that he was referring to a humanism was somewhat in error. So I wanted to take his critique of what he calls theoretical humanism seriously. And it was important to consider how, for Althusser, when he talks about theoretical humanism, he's in part, there's a couple of historical reasons why he's doing this. One, I think, was because he challenged after the death of Stalin, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union adopted what they officially called socialist humanism. And for Althusser, he saw that as a continuation of what he referred to as the Stalinian deviation, the deviation in Marxist-Leninist philosophy. And through his writing on this, he talked about in a number of places, not least of which is reading Capital and for Marx, the problems in Stalinism of an economism, a historicism, a technologism, and a humanism. And at first glance, you can start to see that his critique of humanism or socialism, or you might think that it's a moral or some kind of he equates humanism with ideology, and that never really stuck with me. I never really understood what he saw as ideological in the concept of humanism, because my thinking for a very long time had been, well, Marxism is a humanism. I thought for a long time I was thinking about if the goal of a Marxist dialectical materialist, historical materialist understanding of something like communism, if that's the goal, right? If the end of class oppression and exploitation is the goal, how could you not see that as a humanism? So it was very puzzling to me, and I really wanted to understand what Althusser was getting at. So with the concepts of economism and technologism, you could see that what he was criticizing in the Stalinian deviation was this very mechanistic way of thinking about technology, economy and technology as the driving forces of history, that it's necessary to advance and develop the means of production, that you advance the infrastructure or the base, and that's the way that you lead history towards its inevitable, and I'm putting in scare quotes, inevitable conclusion with the arrival of communism. So Althusser challenges that very mechanistic way of seeing things in in Stalin. Um, but he also talks about historicism. Historicism is one of the other ways that he's criticizing the Stalinian deviation. And the way that I understand how he reads historicism, it comes in one of his later essays, I think, where he's equating the Hegelian category of the negation to his view of historicism. And the way that I've understood that view of the negation, and I think that it comes very much in a lot of the Marxist humanist writing of the 20th century. In the French scene, people largely Henri Lefebvre and Guy Debord are good examples of Marxist humanists who were thinking this at the time. A lot of people that were influenced by the Hegel lectures of Alexander Kojève, I think, saw Marxism as moving in this way. And if I can put it this way, the Marxist humanist conception of the negation kind of reads in this way, that history begins where we have this harmonious species being, where there's this natural equality between humanity and all of nature to some extent, but then there's a point of alienation or being estranged from that nature, right? That we estrange ourselves from it, or we are estranged from it by different modes of production. Of course, capitalism is well known for discussions around practices of alienation of the working class being separated from the means of production and the wealth produced. But then and that would be the first negation. But then the second negation, and again, I want to reemphasize that the way I'm explaining this is how I see the Marxist humanists understanding it, that the negation of the negation is a reconciliation with nature so that we become disalienated, and that's when we can think this end point of history with the arrival of communism in that way. And what I see Althusser doing, in fact, is criticizing that view of history as very much idealist. And then if you go backwards from that, you can understand why he's critical of the category of alienation, because he sees it as being represented in that way. But he also then sees those categories as humanist categories, right? Now, the other reason why he disagreed with this idea of a socialist humanism it's kind of odd, because when you continue to read Althusser, it still seems like he's talking like what I would think of as a humanism, as communism, as the end of class struggle, and so on, even though he says in different places that class struggle is the motor of history. So you start to imagine, if class struggle is the motor of history and communism is this end of class struggle, then I still see that expressed in Althusser's philosophy. And what he saw, socialist humanism for him, was this idea that you could have this end of exploitation within socialism. And this is also coming off the back of I think it's the 1936 Constitution of the Soviet Union, where Stalin declares the end of class struggle under socialism. But Althusser, being a very close reader of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, knows that according to that perspective, socialism is still the continuation of class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat, that every state is a class state, and socialism, according to the doctrine of Marxist-Leninism, socialism is still a class state, but under the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that the proletariat is meant to use the mechanism of the state to end class exploitation, at which point the state is supposed to wither away and we have communism. Excuse me. So I'll put it this way. I agree very much with Althusser's critique of the Marxist humanist understanding of history and the way that economy and technology is supposed to operate. I agree with him very much, but I don't agree with him in calling his approach a theoretical anti-humanism for a couple of reasons. One reason is that um, um, I still see a Marxist type project as being a humanism, not in the sense of reconciliation that you see in and disalienation that you see in Marxist humanism, but as an approach that is aimed at securing the material needs of global universal humanity. I can't see what Marxism is trying to do if it's not doing that. If it's not trying to materially secure the needs of the people, right? So I disagree with him, and I still disagree with him on his view and the Marxist view of communism, and that's why I don't call myself a communist. Is because I can't envision if class struggle is the motor of history, then I can't envision any end point where there would be an end to class struggle, an end to political struggle. It's just that because the conditions our historical conditions are always contingent and ever changing, and every time there's a historical transformation, we have to rethink what we mean by emancipation, by freedom, by how we're going to fight class struggle. So because of that, I think that by adopting a concept of humanism, even as a scientific concept in the historical materialist sense that Althusser wants to use, it's a way of saying that in every new contingent historical situation, our mission is to place the interests of universal humanity at the forefront and develop whatever practices, tactics, institutions, rules, and laws, and whatever you want to call it, that need to be put into place in order to develop and guarantee and protect those needs. So that gives you more of a sense of why I still, or what kind of humanism I'm interested in. And I call it a dialectical humanism, but I'm against I say it's very at the beginning that it's not a book about Marxist humanism because one, I'm very much clearly influenced by a Marxist approach, and I'm defending a humanism, but I don't want that to be confused with the 20th century historicist, economist, technologist idea of humanism that Althusser critiquing. And the last thing I'll say about that is that it's fascinating to me that when I now the way that I understand why Althusser called humanism an ideology is because when you read a lot of the Marxist humanist literature, it comes off as a kind of a moralism and not as a dialectical understanding of history. And I think that that's one of the problems that we face today in a lot of contemporary critical theory on the left in particular, that there's a move away from a strong materialist and dialectical understanding of history in the way that Marx develops it, particularly in his later work. And of course, the way that I read Hegel the way that Žižek does and the way that Todd McGowan does very much as a materialist. I think that there's a movement away from that and more of an emphasis on using moralism and guilt politics as a way, and it comes off, and I think it's driven by a form of elitism. So when I think about what Althusser was criticizing as humanism in those terms, that's what I see very much happening in a lot of the post-humanisms, especially the critical post-humanisms that give more of a focus to issues and questions of nature or naturalness or nativisms of different kinds, as opposed to a post-humanism that's focused on the technological development or advancement of humanity or transhumanism. I think that those things are different, but very much in the critical post-humanisms of people like Rosie Braidotti, for instance. I see it very much as driven by using guilt politics and moralism as driving, and that's what I think Althusser's critique of Marxist humanism really amounted to. So that's why I say it's not a book of Marxist humanism. Thanks. That was long. I'm sorry.
All good. No, that was very clarifying. So I think the best move here, although like saying this, it's like, hey, just summarize every chapter in your book, because I know what kind of task that is. But I do like the idea of somebody who's coming to the text to have an idea of, you know, what you're doing, because there's 6 main chapters, and just however you want to do it. I just like the idea of, you know, people understanding what the core content and what the core arguments you're making along the way as you develop the book.
Yeah, thanks. No, I agree with you. I think that it's good, and I'll try it as best as I can. So, the book actually begins with a preface, and I use the space of the preface to try to explain. To put it simply, it's a big topic, right? I mean, humanism is a concept that has a very long history, going back to Renaissance humanism. There are even prior to that religious forms of humanism, but the humanism of Vico, for instance, trying to cover all of that would be impossible. Trying to cover every detail about contemporary post-humanisms would be impossible. So I use the preface as a way of explaining why I couldn't possibly get into all of that, and I try to give also a definition of how I'm interpreting how I understand the use of the word humanism. Then the chapters. So, kind of what I wanted to do, the first half of the book, which is to say the first 3 chapters, are really trying to take on the different types of post-humanism that I see as being ideological. I guess the main thrust of it was to try to show that there's a kind of rhetorical contradiction, like a performative contradiction in post-humanist discourse, which I don't think that I'm not by any stretch the first person to point this out. Very inspired by some of the work of the humanist scholar Kate Soper, who's in the UK in the 80s, had a wonderful book on different critical theory conceptions of humanism. I think it's called Humanism and Anti-Humanism, from around 86 or 87. And then in some of her more recent work, she's trying to also point out this performative contradiction that appears in largely critical post-humanist writing and new materialisms of people like Jane Bennett, or excuse me, I just sounded like a bar mitzvah boy. My voice cracked. I'm trying to remember their name. Meeting the Universe Halfway. I'm trying to remember the name of the author of that book, but it'll come back to me when I finish saying this. Um, but Kate Soper, she tries to point out that in advocating for, so there's I'll say first of all, there's many different ways to understand posthumanism, and the term has been deployed in many different directions. What I try to do in the book is to I reduce this to two types of posthumanism, what I call critical posthumanism and speculative posthumanism. Critical posthumanism, I would say, is closer to new materialisms. Some of it is very much influenced by Quentin Meillassoux and his critique of correlationism, object-oriented ontology, Graham Harman, Levi Bryant, that type of work. Some ideas about panpsychism from Stephen Shaviro. All of these that I put under critical posthumanism have more to do with the human nature, human dash nature relationship, whereas what I call speculative posthumanism is more like a focus on like transhumanism, accelerationism, different ways of conceiving the human technological relationship. So what Soper tried to show with critical posthumanism, that first group that is more the nature human or nature culture nexus, that a lot of the argument coincides with the discourse around Anthropocene, and the problem is perceived to be too much anthropocentrism, that the human is constantly the being centered, and by centering the human, we've caused all this degradation and harm to non-human animals, non-human nature, and so on and so forth, so that the ethical imperative for critical posthumanism is a reduction of the human, to try to eliminate the human, to try to push back on the human. And there's even some, odd, I think, kind of experimental interpretations of this. Some that try to, like panpsychism, seeing not just humans, but all objects as having mind of some kind. Or there's a humanism, which tries to use a kind of an odd, low tone therapeutic way of writing and speaking, to say that we should allow the human species to die out, but with care and love and all this stuff. And I just think about everybody sitting around the circle drinking the Kool-Aid and doing the ethical job of getting rid of humanity. But Soper points out, I think quite well, that no matter what you're doing, you're still centering the human in all of your actions. Like, who other than the human is going to engage in the ethical practices that are being advocated for here? Right. So on the one hand, it's trying to decenter the human, but at the same time, it recenters human practice to get human self-annihilation, right, as the practice. So she points out that there is this performative contradiction, and there's others who identify it in different ways too. Alenka Zupancic has the wonderful line. It's near the end of What is Sex? She says, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact wording, but something to the effect of there's an odd contradiction in trying to, or that you have to, a subject has to be present before you can start to think about the imbalances that made you want to create an egalitarian project in the first place. Right. So, and there's other people that have pointed this out. So the first chapter of the book is really trying to deal with this performative contradiction in critical posthumanism, and to explain why I think that there's a necessity to renew humanism within this context. And again, largely it's because if it's only human subjectivity that can have an ethical impact on these conditions, then rather than trying to decenter and escape the human, we should take ownership of it, right? We should reclaim the human because that's the methodological, ethical, aesthetic position from which we're able to grapple with and act on the problems that we're talking about. So the second chapter then kind of tries to take up the same problematic and focus mostly on critical posthumanism. But what I try to do, beginning with, so Susan Buck-Morss, who's been one of my favorite writers for a very long time, great Hegel scholar, great scholar of the Frankfurt School and critical theory. But one of my favorite essays by her is a piece on Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Some people just call it the artwork essay. I like to call it the artwork essay to make it easier. In the artwork essay, she's focusing on the end. So she has, her piece is called on something as anesthetics as opposed to aesthetics, and you could think anesthetics kind of like anesthesia, right? So she takes up the ending of Benjamin's artwork essay, where he says something to the effect of with war, humanity can enjoy its own self-destruction. And then she moves on to differentiate between fascism and communism in terms of aesthetics. She very famously, or Benjamin very famously says that fascism results in the aestheticization of politics. Communism responds by politicizing art. And Buck-Morss, in her essay on anesthetics, wants to take up this idea of what it means to aestheticize politics. And she describes it ultimately as the aestheticization of politics is more like an anesthetization, in the sense that it numbs us to the political. It numbs us to the political. It puts us, we fall asleep and we're not able to really discern our true position within the political. So I tried to argue in the second chapter that what posthumanism is doing, in a sense, it's working to anesthetize us to the political conditions that we face. So I try to get at that by initially looking at Kant's philosophy of aesthetics and Hegel's philosophy of aesthetics, and to show that there is an important relationship between the aesthetic and the dialectic in the second sense that Benjamin talks about, which is to politicize art. And one of the things that Hegel does, for instance, in his lectures on aesthetics, he talks about how art is the way that we can represent the world to ourselves in order to bring ourselves towards self-contemplation. And when we are doing that, we are bringing to consciousness something of what can lead us to an ethical position. So I then use that to move on to, I think it's fascinating to me that a lot of the critical posthumanists are against a notion of representation. And it's kind of inherited from a lot of the post-structuralist philosophy that's relied upon in their work. Anyone from Foucault to Deleuze and Guattari to Jacques Derrida, they have, Foucault, in the order of things, finishes throughout the book, but at the end finishes with a critique of the category of representation. And you see this very much throughout Foucault's, when he's talking about his critique of discourse. His discourse analysis can very much coincide with a critique of representation. And it appears to me, when going back to posthumanism, it appears to me that the posthumanist critique of representation is sort of the flip side of the post-structuralist critique of representation. One of the things that you can see in the post-structuralism critique is that it's very Kantian in a sense, in the sense that, just as for Kant, we can know only our knowledge of things, but we cannot know things in themselves. The post-structuralist position seems to be something to the effect of we can know only our representations of things as they exist in discourse, but we cannot know things in themselves. So that was their critique of representation. But the posthumanists, many of them, what they do is they say, well, the problem is that even post-structuralism is too humanist because it relies only on representations. So if we want to escape anything that is anthropocentric, we have to be able to move past the representations. We have to be able to get at things themselves. And that's what you see. So somebody like Graham Harman or Stephen Shaviro again, or Braidotti in a certain way, Karen Barad, that's who I was thinking of before with the Meeting the Universe Halfway, has a lot of their work is a challenge to the category of representation. So I try to attend to this as a kind of anesthetization and argue for the need to go back to forms of representation, not in a structuralist way, but in a dialectical way, because it's only by following the path of the representation. So as I said before, we begin when we as Žižek would put it in talking about dialectics, you begin by positing the presuppositions. Every form of thought has to begin with the positing of a set of presuppositions against which we can then come to understand the various different lacks or gaps or contradictions in the trajectory in order to be able to arrive at the point where we can grasp that it was the initial presupposition that was inherently flawed, but we can then reposit them and think conditions anew, ad infinitum. So I try to use that as a space then to say that the way out of this anesthetizing problem is to return to a methodological need for deploying representation. Some of this goes back to Althusser too, because Althusser makes a strong connection between representation and ideology. So I think that for a couple of generations of scholars, in critical theory, and especially influenced by French critical theory, there's this sense that our job should be just to challenge and critique and to deconstruct every representation so that we can get at the hard ground beneath the representation, and every positing or repositing of a new representation, right? Deleuze and Guattari talk about the despotism of the tyrannical signifier, right? That the best strategy then is to try to deconstruct every representation, and that's going to be our modality. But as I kind of see this, and I'm influenced somewhat here by Anna Kornblue, for instance, and especially her recent work. It was kind of interesting. I was writing this just as her book was coming out. I was finishing my book just as her book was coming out. So I had, very quickly I commented somewhat on her book. But even her previous book, The Order of Forms, I think does a really good job of arguing for the need to develop representation and mediation as a way to fulfill thought and critical thought in particular. Where was I with this?
Is there a connection to immediacy?
No. I was going to say, I wanted to say that from Anna, I like to talk about the difference between a politics of tearing things down, burn it all down kind of mentality, which is something I see a lot of the critical posthumanism and even people inspired by post-structuralism as trying to do. It's all about tear it down, burn it down. What Anna Kornblue, I think, kind of riffing off of Gombe in a way, or criticizing Gombe, talks about as a destituent politics, as opposed to a constituent or a constructive politics of building things up. It's late. I'm losing it here. So I think that bringing back the category of representation and mediation is a way to work on this ethic of building it up. You build up the new and you develop the new so that the old can wither away. Right. So thinking about that way. So that's what I do. The first two chapters are focused on critical posthumanism in those ways. Chapter 3, I then try to move to the technological side of posthumanism. You can think about the first set.
You think maybe we should save the discussion because chapter 3 I really want to go into. So maybe can we skip and you kind of summarize 4, 5, and 6, and then we'll kind of really focus on chapter 3?
Yeah, we can do that. And I should also say, please, I could just talk without stopping. Like my wife likes to tell me that she has a 20-minute timeline, and she'll let me know when that 20-minute timeline is up. But if you don't stop me,
no, but you've been doing a great job of just giving a summary of what the book is. And that's
but I don't want to bore people. I don't want to bore people with.
Well, that's the point is to get. Well, look.
That's what they're here for.
Let's do this because
you could every now and then you could jump in and you could say thanks next or something.
No, like okay, hold on. Let's just talk about chapter 3 for now, and then we can come back because you do a lot of cool things. Chapter 3 is the one that I focused on the most, and. Look, me coming at things from a Žižekian perspective a lot of the time, I'm always interested in somebody who can take his idea of ideological fantasy and really flesh it out, apply it to, different examples. And that's what I love about chapter 3 so much, because here you talk about like post-human fantasies. And so there's the capitalist post-human fantasy, there's the automation/accelerationist post-human fantasy. There's the speculative post-human fantasy as opposed to the critical post-humanist fantasy. And then fourth, there is the technological naturalist fantasy. So I'm interested, I think this is a core contribution here, thinking this our current situation. Let's talk about these different fantasies that you see at play in our situation.
Yeah, sure. So let me just say, I don't know if it's apparent, but I think the last 2 chapters that I wrote for the book were this chapter. I can't remember which one came first because I was writing them both simultaneously. But chapter 3, variations of the post-human fantasy, and chapter 5, which is the chapter on Althusser, those were the last chapters that I wrote. But this chapter, I think, was the most fun to write because it was. I think these are the versions of posthumanism that I've kind of some of them that I've kind of at different times felt I aligned with a little bit more. Accelerationism or left accelerationism, the accelerationism of Cernick and Williams, and the map, the manifesto for an accelerationist politics. There are periods of my work where I felt very closely aligned to those. So I was interested after going through all of this in rethinking that. And then other things that I found were really fun for me in writing this chapter is, my background, I actually come out of a media and cultural studies kind of background. And people like Marshall McLuhan were formative to my education, and I still love one of my favorite things to teach, even though nobody, I wouldn't call myself this and nobody would think. I think that it's surprising to people sometimes how much of an interest I have in Marshall McLuhan, but I have a critical interest in Marshall McLuhan, and I really wanted to try to get at that with this work, especially because McLuhan has been such a huge influence on this sort of technological side of the post-human, right? There's post-humanism, right? Post of a humanism, and there's the post-human, right? So McLuhan, I think, has been and along McLuhan and people like Baudrillard, not just Deleuze and Guattari. I think that these are staple theorists in my formative education that I haven't been able to write about as much as I would have liked to. So this chapter was very fun for me to do in that way. So what I wanted to do with it is I get that some people might disagree with how I define this, and I'm going to be a bit reductive for this space, but I kind of define fantasy in the Lacanian sense as a scenario of completeness, right? That there is a wholeness, right?
You also call it substantialization, right?
Substantialization, right? Yeah, that's what Todd McGowan would kind of put it in those terms. And Todd, of course, is in many different ways a huge influence on some of my thinking in this book, which I can get to maybe later on. So I try to define fantasy in the Lacanian sense as this substantialization. You're right. And part of my thinking about it is I might have a kind of an unorthodox or a heterodox way of explaining my understanding of Lacan's philosophy of subjectivity and how it relates to things like jouissance, desire, and the like. But when we talk about subjectivization and the moment when the subject in Lacanian theory emerges into the symbolic order, and I get this from Žižek, it's kind of this moment of what he calls a forced choice, right? That in the moment of entry into the symbolic order, we have the choice. We have all the choices that we can imagine available to us, right? But we have to make a choice. And most of us who are normal people, which in my terms is just like once you become a neurotic, anyone who, most of us when we're entering, we choose to identify with the gaze of the big other. We choose to identify, we take on, a phallic or a signifier way that we identify. But in the process of making that choice, of affirming that choice, we also negate all of the other possible choices that we could have been, right? And we feel alienated from those choices that we didn't make in that way. And that's what, again, to be somewhat reductive, that's one of the ways I think we can imagine what Lacan meant by the objet petit-a, or the object cause of desire, where we're driven to pursue this lost object, as Todd sometimes calls it. We pursue this lost object, which is the object cause of desire. It's a pure nothing, but it motivates our pursuit of this thing we feel that we have lost. And fantasy comes in to imagine the scenario where we can regain it and substantialize ourselves, right? So what I try to describe in the chapter are four examples of this type of a fantasy of post-human. Now, I will add, though, the reason why I call it a post-human fantasy, and it goes along with what I critique as a kind of a substantialization as well in Marxist humanism, with that understanding of negation, of returning to, that basic nature of disalienation. That wouldn't completeness in that sense just mean the elimination of the human as such? Because if we think about what I try to argue too in the book, and this is where I align very much with Todd McGowan, is that I see alienation as a constitutive part of subjectivity, as opposed to something that's contingent that we can eliminate and get rid of. So wouldn't disalienation, if our human subjectivity is the product of alienation, wouldn't disalienation mean that we disappear, right? As subjects, at least, right? So I call this a post-human fantasy because it's all of these various different ways that it seems that the disappearance of the human will bring full substantialization. The first of which is the capitalist post-human fantasy. Right. And I draw on people like Ernest Mandel, his book Late Capitalism, where I think people should read and reread Late Capitalism because of the ways that Mandel addresses everybody wants to know what is late capitalism, but what he's talking about is a later technological development of capitalism that really starts with, what we today talk about as the information society that was really developing in the 1960s. So he has a lot of really important things to say about the development of technology under capitalism. And people like Alfred Sohn-Rethel, I draw on a bit, and David Harvey. So what's interesting to me is that what I try to do, and this is going against Jameson's view in a certain way, because Jameson thought about the emergence of the hysterical sublime, the technological sublime, as something that was part of postmodernism. But part of my argument is that this is something that's always been part of capitalism, at least in, a nascent, unborn, part of capitalism from its very beginning. And you can see that in the way that capitalism or liberalism, which I will say I don't want to go too much into this, but liberalism, I think, is the spontaneous ideology of capitalism in various different forms. And the liberal conception of the human subject as citizen, let's say, I think coincides with a capitalist understanding of subject that coincides with private property. That even for the working class, right? Because the working class is humanized insofar as the working class has a commodity, has a commodity that they can, objectify in a certain way and sell for money and enter into market relations. So when the working class self-commodifies its labor power, it's humanizing itself because it can then sell that into the market. And then I said working class very strategically because I think the way to differentiate between working class that sells its ability to work in the market, it's humanized in that way, from the proletariat, because I see proletarianization as the way in which, through its logical unfolding, the capitalist development of the means of production, the capitalist investment in technology, because it helps to advance, cheapen in some ways, it's labor saving, right? Labor saving technology, that because of these developments, there's a downward pressure on the working class that are proletarianized by being dejected. And while they have an initial humanization through the ownership of private property in the form of commodified labor power, there's a dehumanization in the process of proletarianization that is further objectifying and getting rid of the human component. It objectifies and then gets rid of the human component. And as we, people who read Marxy kind of stuff know that, capitalism is constantly dealing with, various different crises, different types of contradictions that are inherent, imminent in the capitalist mode of production. But the capitalist fantasy is one of a fully functioning, frictionless, seamless type of capitalism that doesn't encounter these kinds of problems. And it's interesting that this substantialization of the capitalist mode of production as a post-human system, right, that it is, real human beings that are feeling the effects of this, right? So I think that the capitalist post-human fantasy, I think, is the elementary basic fantasy. And I should say, I didn't mention it, but I analyze these four, but I say somewhere that I don't know that these are not the only four permutations. I think there could be others, but these are ones that I wanted to look at.
Sure. Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense for the first one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah, Nance, what do you think?
No, I think that's it. I think that's the utopian dream. That's the version of modernity that we got stuck with, because we don't have any power and we are kind of trapped in this objectifying system. And the people running the show all think, yeah, this is great. We're going to go to Mars and we're going to develop life extension technology, and it's great. And never mind the global South, and never mind the global proletariat. And you're made to look foolish if you take up this position of like, no, this is not good enough, because you are going against this mandate of capital is here to save the day.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. One thing I wanted to add, though, is that in talking about this, I want to stress that my critique here is not one of technology as such, right? I mean, I don't see myself as a Luddite, or I don't think that, and I think that technology does end up, and this is something Žižek has pointed out even in Heidegger, that, the critique of technology functions as a scapegoat. The critique of modernity functions as a scapegoat for the deleterious aspects of the capitalist mode of production, right? And I think that, the a dialectical vision of emancipation, I think, should try to, sublation Aufhebung, in the sense of you want to elevate, what's functioning and negate the deleterious aspects, right? And part of the problem is the way that a capitalist mode of production creates wealth for the few and is not capable of distributing it in an equitable way, so that what you want to do is negate the inequitable social relations that are part of the inequitable division of wealth, and you want to preserve and universalize, if as much as we can, and I say as much as we can because I'm not an end of history guy, so it's always, new condition, we got to keep fighting for it, but that should still be the goal. That's the goalpost that we should always be aiming at, right? And part of the reason I say this is because, I like to jokingly say, like, I'm a post-human in the sense that I'm a person living with type 1 diabetes, and I rely very much on the technological advances in medical science. The standard today, or the standard of care that's becoming the standard, is what's called looping. So I wear a constant glucose monitor where I can check my blood sugar on my phone, and there's a device called an Omnipod. You wear it on your body, and it can connect to your phone too, and you can administer insulin. And people are creating apps with an algorithm so that the two devices communicate with each other, effectively creating an artificial pancreas, right? So that, to me, this is a development that I think is the kind of thing that should be universalized, because it raises the standard quality of care via technological means, right? But I wanted to make sure that was clear, and that that's a segue into the next one I look at, which is what I call the accelerationist, right?
Yeah,
the accelerationist fantasy.
And
so
what's Nick Land's fundamental fantasy?
The main reason I was nervous about coming to talk to you guys is because listening to what you and reading what you have to say about Nick Land, Mikey, like, you've given me a very different way about thinking about Nick Land, for a long time, because, in the first Trump presidency, I was, writing a lot about, right accelerationism and neo-reaction and dark enlightenment kind of stuff as sort of part of, this, I don't know what you want to call it, like right-wing conspiracy, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But, so a lot of what you've been talking about, the last couple of years with Nick Land. Now, I don't think that I agree with him yet, and I think that that's a lot to do with, I kind of read a sort of, and you're gonna, you might tell me I'm wrong, and go ahead, tell me if I'm wrong. I see a kind of like a nihilistic tendency that, as somebody who thinks of himself as a humanist, I find it
that's there.
Okay. So,
I'll just say, like, as he's gotten older, he's changed. But I mean, early on, it's funny. Like, even when I talk to him, I'm sometimes like, did you write Thirst for Annihilation? Because it doesn't seem that way sometimes. But I mean, it was an essay on nihilistic or atheistic religion, right? So he early on very much is tapped into that. As he's gotten older, God or the divine, and whether it's in the form of lemurs or artificial intelligences, but whatever the lofty powers are for him, there just seems to be these developments. And because he doesn't write systematic, books, where he really fleshes it all out, anybody who follows him, you kind of just got to piece it together the best you can about where he's at. But even if you look at the stuff in Fang Numina, it seems like there's a very sharp inevitability to the end of humanity via the acceleration of capital. And now, he's the first one to like cast doubt on the Terminator scenarios and all that. And he's like, there's just, why would the smartest entity on the planet just immediately go for the nukes? Like, that makes no sense. So I would just say there's a lot of developments. He doesn't lay it out in a systematic way, but what you do here, I think, really does apply to a certain land. And in my own work, I think that for me, like, his fundamental fantasy is rooted in how he views intelligence as such, and that somehow artificial intelligence is going to develop to the point where it's just not split. It's godlike. It's and yeah, there's this thing with the numogram where he always wants to bring multiplicity into it, and you want to go, well, if there's multiple super intelligences, do we really believe they're going to be all harmonious? He seems to always reject harmony and unity, and yet when he describes intelligence, it seems to be something that is thought of in a substantialist type of way, where it's not divided, it's not split, it's not human in any way that we would conceive of the human. So I think this kind of, I think now, even if there's a fundamental fantasy at work with him, it is rooted in how he thinks about superintelligence and what that thing would be like. But that's just where I'm coming from with it.
That makes a lot of sense to me. When you were talking about this, actually, because I know you wanted to talk about intelligence at some point.
Yeah.
But you mentioned this to me, so I was thinking about this. Because one of the books that I really like, and I think I cited a couple of times in my new book, is Reza Negarestani's Intelligence and Spirit.
Yeah.
I really dig that book. I mean, I'm less like a Robert Brandom person that I think Reza Negarestani is, but I really like some of the stuff that he did in E-Flux. What were the pieces called? Something about the development of the inhuman or something like that. And a lot of his writing, I think, actually inspired some of the ways I wanted to rethink humanism. But in Intelligence and Spirit, he talks not intelligence, he talks about intelligibility. And I like the way that he describes this because, it does have a sort of a, what I was trying to get at with the Algorithmic Desire book about a new structuralism. It does kind of have, like, his idea of intelligibility does kind of have like a structuralist and maybe, a dialectical way of thinking about it, in that a lot of it has to do with how we create the structures by which we make things meaningful to us, right? That part of what the human subject is doing is creating the categories by which we are making assessments. And I think that, when we talk in Lacanian semiotic terms, when we talk about the production of the master signifier, I think that that's part of what we're doing. So rather than talking about, different types of intelligence, it makes sense to me to talk about the production of intelligibility, how we make things intelligible or meaningful to us through the structures that we create. But I also think that that's an interesting way of thinking about what distinguishes the human subject from non-human subjects or objects, in the sense that the symbolic castration, the cut of the signifier, the way in which, when we are alienated into the symbolic order, I'm using a lot of Lacanian jargon, so sorry.
The vast majority of people watching will probably know it, and if they're if they're on the other side of the fault line, if they come with land and D&G, then they still probably know some of it. So
okay, well, if they don't, fuck them. I don't care. But when we're alienated into the symbolic order, the cut of the signifier, and there's the split that occurs between desire and the death drive. Um, I think that whenever we create intelligent structures that make things intelligible to us, what we can call culture or cultivation or civilization, if we want to use that term. I know some people don't like to, but this is the point of Freud's civilization and its discontents, that for our survival, we need to organize into human collectives to fight off the threats of nature, of external nature. But whenever we construct civilization, whenever we construct culture, and we're forced to create repression and prohibitions to ourselves, something is missing, and we feel deep frustration, and we end up in these pursuits, even of the things that could be harmful to us, to a certain extent, right? So that's where I guess I would find myself on the opposite pole from land when we're talking about something like intelligence.
Okay.
Right.
No, last time Nance and I had a chance to talk to Todd, we asked him this same thing that I want to ask you, which is just with all the time that you've spent with Lacanian, Žižekian, Hegelian theory, we're the most intelligent species on this planet. We're also the species that is characterized, at least for us here, by death drive. Do we have to start thinking a connection between death drive and the production of our level of intelligence? And does it make sense to think that there could be a higher form of intelligence that isn't in any way shaped by a death drive?
Okay, that's a loaded question. Not a loaded question, but it's loaded in the sense that you're gonna have to tell me to shut up at a certain point, because I got a lot to shoot out. Okay, where can I start? I'm still. I don't mean this in a, with any kind of humility. I mean it with a kind of hubris for the human, in a sense that I don't know if I want to say that we're the most intelligent beings on the earth.
Okay.
Okay? That's the first thing that I would say. Now, I'm not one to, say that, the dolphins and the trees are more intelligent than us. I don't mean that. I'm not trying to say that, we have to humble ourselves in the face of all of these other intelligences. That's not what I mean. I just think that in the same way that I was talking about intelligibility as the construction of the structures, the meanings, even the rules, right, against which we're measuring something like intelligence, I think it's something that is self-posited. I think that we self-posit, and that's the way that we grapple with these things. And I think that all the various developments that are the byproduct of human intelligibility, I think, are what we do to grapple with various different historically contingent situations or conditions. Um, I think that I don't know if it's a way to, I do think it's a way to distinguish human subjectivity from the non-human, by talking about something like the death drive. I think that that is something that is part of what it means to be a human subject, because I think that the repression or prohibition on immediate self-gratification, whatever that means to you. I think that there is a weird type of jouissance that we receive from doing that, right? So what I guess I would say is I think that um, I think that human intelligence is historical, and I think that it's the byproduct of the way that we grapple with different historical conditions. I mean, there's a Darwinianism to this, I think. Just as our environmental conditions change and transform, so too do we. We evolve from that, which I think is, a dialectical way of thinking about this that was of interest to somebody like Engels. Um, Now, I'm not a religious person, and I'd say that I'm more agnostic than atheistic in my views here. I just have no proof, right? One way or the other. So I don't think that I could say whether or not there is a super intelligence that supersedes human intelligibility. But I do think that what I would want now, I'll put it this way. I think that to believe in one is a form of substantialization in the way that I talked about fantasy. But now here's what I want to say is I don't think that is necessarily a problem to have this fantasy, because what matters is the way that we relate to the fantasy. And, I get this a bit in a way from Todd McGowan. I get it from Žižek. I guess Todd gets it from, I think it's Rich Boothby. That when we think about traversing the fantasy, it's not necessarily a getting what's beyond the fantasy, but the way that I understand it is it's a recognition that jouissance or access to jouissance is only possible via the fantasy. So if we want to consider the idea of a super intelligence in terms of fantasy, as I've to try to describe it, what matters is that if we want to, we have to acknowledge that this is just a way for us to get jouissance, but that this is not something that we have to accept, that this is not something that we can ever know or achieve or understand. And I don't think that that's transcendental idealism in the Kantian sense, because I think that what it represents is a knowledge that there's an inherent contradiction at the heart of all of reality, and knowing that and recognizing that reality is inherently incomplete, that this is the way that we can understand the material conditions in which we exist.
Okay. So it's
Did I pass? Did I?
No, that was good.
That was very good. I think very good.
Because look, this connection that we're interested in between death drive and intelligence, I mean, nobody's, as far as I know, has actually theoretically worked this out. It's just a kind of hunch that we are going off of, thinking through the ways that death drive could actually spur on intelligence optimization. Insofar as, like, we're the species that denies our biological programming via jouissance and death drive, and there's always a kind of circuitry to how we do this, and it's unconscious. And so you think, like, maybe this opens up a pathway to a form of intelligence that other species just don't have, because they're not constantly trying to undermine themselves for the sake of jouissance in the way that we are.
Because we're not just thermostats. We're not just rote machines. Like we actually have
enjoy our inefficiency.
Goals that we posit. Yeah, we posit our own goals, and then we seek them out. So we have to develop more efficient metabolic processes and more efficient mechanistic. But
we also enjoy getting in the way of that efficiency.
Yeah.
So that's this unique thing with us. Look, time's running out there, but there's a couple things I still really want to hear you talk about real quick. So we'll kind of start winding down, but I got to hear you talk about what you do in chapter 3 in your critiques of Marshall McLuhan, Herbert Marcuse, and Deleuze and Guattari. So tell us what you think is going on with these.
So let me start with McLuhan, because I should say that one colleague that I'm close with at work is a big McLuhan scholar. And hi Jackie, if you ever see this, if you're listening. Who had impacted. I had written off McLuhan a while ago, and it's Jackie's interest in McLuhan that sort of gave me a sense to go back and to reread and to rethink McLuhan. And of course I reread Understanding Media, but one of the books that I really was interested was the Gutenberg Galaxy. And I was interested in the Gutenberg Galaxy at the beginning because of the way McLuhan talks about his project as a humanist project. So I was really interested because that was fascinating to me, because McLuhan, as you probably know, is very much at the heart of a lot of writing on post-humanism. Again, Levi Bryant, I think McLuhan was in what is it, ontocartography, I think, was a key theorist, and others, Donna Haraway in some ways. So I was curious, in what way could McLuhan be thought of as a humanist? One of my favorite, and I think that I teach this now. When I teach McLuhan, I actually have my students read McLuhan's Playboy interview, because I think it's the first best, clearest articulation from him of his various ideas for analyzing media, beginning with his historical conception in the movement from oral tribal culture to the literate culture of the print era, and typography, to the post-literate new orality of the electronic society. And I've always thought that that's a very interesting way of periodizing the development of media. And of course, he inherits this from Harold Innis. I'm doing my due diligence of, presenting Canadian communication theory, right? You got Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan, and Innis periodized in Empire of Communication, which is a great book of history, periodize the movement from an oral culture to a literate culture, oral culture passing, where you have like a time bias where media stands the test of time, a space bias where you reduce time through space, with the advent of print and typography, and then of course, Innes sticks to that, but McLuhan then moves on from the oral and literate that Innes talks about, and he adds the electronic, the new orality. And I love, so again, this is something I try to stress to when I'm teaching McLuhan, is that he has a very aesthetic approach to media, in the sense that he periodizes and understands different media forms at the level of the extension of the human sensory, right? So the different ways that the human sensory is extended by different media, an oral communication, or what he calls a tribal society. There's a holistic extension of the human sensory, like our five senses are all extended in oral communication at the same time. And he then says, and this is, I'll say this in a second, very similar to the conception, the historicism of the Marxist humanists, in the sense that you can remember the way that that conception of negation in Marxist humanism occurs, that you have this, whole, complete, substantial society that then is alienated. We're alienated from it, and then we hope to reconcile with that basic nature that from which we were alienated. So in McLuhan, you move from that oral, tribal, full, sensory extension to a literate society with writing and print and typography, where he says that the visual sense is privileged over all of our other senses. So in a sense, And that's when we have the rise of modernity, the rise of, modern Western conceptions of subjectivity through literacy, where, if we're talking about European languages, um, you read left to right, it's logical, sequential. So that's impacted in the way in which we are thinking, right? Our thought develops as logical, and we see, the development of the Enlightenment with, reasonable rationalism, the scientific method, secularism, and all of these. McLuhan argues that this is the byproduct of a fragmented or an alienated sensory, where the visual is privileged, so that when we then enter electronic society, right, with telegraphy, radio, television, of course, the internet. When we get to this period, he argues that we have a recombined sensory, right? And that's why he calls it a new tribalism or a new orality, a new oral culture where the sensory is recombined. So you have this kind of a disalienation present in this historical trajectory. So it's fascinating to me that what I kind of gathered that the humanism that McLuhan is developing is historicist in the same way that the Marxist humanists were historicists. That there's this sense of reconciliation with some kind that is the byproduct of getting rid of a form of a repression or an alienation, right? So I see this.
Just to be clear, what McLuhan has in common with certain Marxists, the Marxist humanist types, is that at some point we reach a disalienation. We return to a kind of established harmony.
Yeah, and I would say that what McLuhan would say are the problems of today is that we have a world now with digital natives that have lived their entire lives in electronic society. McLuhan might argue that the problems we face today are the byproduct of a new tribal culture that is administered in the form of a literate society. And that what is problematic is that there's this, power, he wouldn't talk in these terms, right? But you could say that, power is the product of the monopoly over the literate society, but that there is, this newly emerging, a complete post-literate society that could develop. And I think that that's part of the sense of what he means by a global village. I think that a lot of people take this term global village and they imagine it as like this, harmonious but connected, right? Connected society. But as I read him, what he means is that it would be a neo-tribalism, that we'd return back to these the tribal forms that were part of the original oral culture, but just now at a much grander, a larger level. But what I think is interesting when you read somebody then like Jean Baudrillard, who talks about, and one of my favorite pieces by Baudrillard is his essay Ecstasy of Communication, and he talks about the postmodern, the electronic society that McLuhan talked about. It's a society without a subject, and you understand what he means by that in McLuhan's sense when we consider that if subjectivity is a product of Western Enlightenment, modernity, the literate culture, right? Then the reconciliation that comes after that would mean the end of the subject, right? The disappearance of the subject. The end, in different ways, it could either be the end of representation, or it could be total representation, nothing but representation, which I think is what Baudrillard is getting at with his conception of hyper reality, that the real has disappeared and all there is representation. So you can really see where McLuhan, influences this postmodern way of thinking about things, but it's very much, I think, still historicist in the way that Althusser was critical of the Marxist humanists for that conception of reconciliation.
And then you see this same thing about the fantasy of reaching a point of disalienation. You see that in Marcuse and D&G as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Marcuse is much more well known for his critique of advanced industrial society, which is really prominent in the first half of One Dimensional Man. But if you look throughout his writing, and it's fast, again, just as McLuhan has been considered a humanist writer, Marcuse is somebody who has also been considered a humanist or a fellow traveler of Marxist humanism. He had close interactions with people like C.L.R. James and Raya Danevskaya, and he kind of, in certain way, forms of his writing on Hegel falls into, a similar humanist point of view as those other writers. But it's interesting in his writing, you can see that, whereas he's criticizing advanced industrial society under capitalism, because of the way that it produces, different forms of repression, his idea of repressive desublimation in advanced industrial society and the consumer society, and all that stuff. But there's a sense where he's, very much a traditional Marxist in his view that he still believes that through the development of the means of production that will bring liberation. That if you keep advancing, and he's kind of accelerationist, avant la lettre in the the Cernick and Williams type of sense, that you just advance the means of production and that will bring the destruction of the deleterious forces of capitalist exploitation. Right? You can see this in the utopianism of Marcuse's writing about technology. But what I think is really interesting about it is that he's also, one of the Frankfurt School Freudo-Marxists, right? So with books like Eros and Civilization, where he argues, his concept of surplus repression, where there is a primary repression, but then additional repression that is creating, the desire for consumer goods that is, grafting the proletariat onto, capitalism. What I think is really interesting about the Freudo-Marxists of the Frankfurt School, what they what they try to do, and you kind of see then, when you understand what the Freudo-Marxists were doing, you can understand, somebody like Michel Foucault's criticism of psychoanalysis and the repressive hypothesis, in the beginning of the history of sexuality, that Marcuse was trying to show that there was some kind of libidinal attachment of people to capitalism via the forms of repression that exist. Um, and he also kind of equates that with the intervention of the reality principle getting in the way of the pleasure principle. So you can start to see in some of his writing a point where he almost says once the means of production advanced to a level where it could emancipate the masses, then there will be an end to this surplus repression and a dissolution of the unnecessary reality principle, and we can just simply exist as a society of pleasure principle. So again, there's that historicist kind of arc where you can see, in Marcuse, that the end point, the utopian end point, is this one of the elimination of repression. And I see that again, just, it's close to accelerationism because it, to me, resembles very much what Deleuze and Guattari are doing in the Capitalism and Schizophrenia books, especially when you
The
think
new
about
earth being this point of disalienation, freedom from repression. Yeah.
right. And, if you think about, going back to the post-humanist disdain for representation, I mean, it is a project of constant deterritorialization, of railing against the despotism of the tyrannical signifier, right? So that if you know, return back to this, and I love the way that they talk about in Thousand Plateaus, it's just a few pages, but when they talk about social subjection and machinic enslavement, right? the terms are confusing because what I see the meaning by machinic enslavement is a positive, right? Is a return to where we become desiring machines, right? And all, the hand machine is connected to the Diet Coke machine, which
Yeah.
is, and what you're doing is when you return to machinic enslavement and you eliminate with the, social subjection, what they call social subjection to me just reads the same as, the old Althusserian form of interpolation of the subject, that ideology interpolates individuals as subjects, that we only exist as subjects in ideology, and ideology is representation, so that if we deterritorialize the representation, we can end subjectivity and therefore subjection and inequality and return back to this plane of pure immanence in machinic enslavement. So to me, it's the same old historicist formula of harmony, alienation, reconciliation, right? And I see
Yeah.
that happening across all of these figures. And for me, then it was kind of a way of saying, well, and that's why I call it a technological naturalism, because it's via technology that we return back to this plane of pure immanence.
Can you say
So
all
I guess
these narratives have a certain, at least in a specific way, a theist fantasy operating underneath them, insofar as there was once, a harmonious state, then there's a fall, then there's a reconciliation where we're restored.
Yeah, I think of it some, as messianic, right?
Yeah.
There's a, Christological, and I think that that's, when Fred Jameson talks about the utopian moment in every ideology, that's where I see it. So I think that this is why, he, I wrote a piece for a collection called Žižek and Modernism. I think that's the title. But I wrote about, he would totally disagree with me, but I still think, he's a major influence on my thinking here. I still think that Slavoj is, I think he's a humanist. When he calls communism, I don't see anything in it, right? And that's why a lot of people give him, the Marxist left give him flack, because they say he's not a real communist, because their understanding of communist is that, Marxist Leninist one of the, dictatorship of the proletariat, producing a society where the state will wither away, and then we'll have communism, right? That's not what Slavoj means.
And we're free of
at all.
contradiction.
And free of exactly, right? That's right. So I don't think that that's what he doesn't mean at all. So I actually say sometimes to people, and I'll tell you this, but then I'll have to kill you afterwards because it's classified. But
Okay.
a lot of what I mean by humanism, I think, is very close to what Slavoj talks about as communism. Um, I just don't like communism. To me, I think, is a useless term. At this point, I think that it tends to serve more elite middle class interests than it does the masses. Intellectuals, left-wing intellectuals, academics. I don't think that it has any practical usage for the masses or the conditions in which we exist.
And I tell my communist friends, like, look, I'm about as blue collar as it gets, working in a warehouse. You're not going to organize those guys and those girls under the signifier communism. You can maybe organize them, but they're not going to embrace it. And so, it's this thing where I'm like, can we get over this word? Because I don't know how it works in other parts of the world. I have no doubt that there are certain countries that are completely receptive to that. But America, your average worker is not receptive to that signifier. I don't think, not just America, I think anywhere there are an exploited and oppressed peoples, especially in places that have felt actually existing communism or socialism. I don't think it's what a Lacanian would call the quilting point, in the way that Todd McGowan
defines it as, talks about it, emphasizes it as a punctuation,
Yeah.
right? It's a dead end. It's a game ender from the get go, right?
Agreed.
So it's a deal breaker. So I think that it's useless. So I think that, there's a couple of places where Žižek has talked about the need for a super anthropocentrism, right? That is a way that I think of what I mean by a humanism, especially a dialectical humanism.
Well, and see, when you say he's a humanist, I mean, like, I'm not the biggest expert on his work, but I've spent a lot of time with it, and I totally agree, whether he likes the word or not. I'll tell you another thing. There's a sense where he's an existentialist. He's not going to call himself that either, but right. The way that he reads Lacan, I'm sorry, it's incredibly existential, and that's why it resonates with so many people. And so, certain words he doesn't like, but is there a humanistic dimension to it? Of course. Is there an existentialist dimension? Yeah. And so it's also, in those of us who are influenced by him, to kind of get past some of his word choices and be able to think through deeper tendencies in his work that, maybe kind of get obfuscated by his reluctance to use certain words.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And one of the things I'll say, so I think that, let me start with this. Part of it, I think his aversion to humanism as a term, I think comes from his context in the former Yugoslavia, because one of the most prominent schools of Marxist philosophy at that time was the Praxis school of Marxist humanism. And one of the core tenets of the Praxis school of humanism was the idea of worker self-management and full transparency. Now, anybody who's read any of Zizek's work will know that he argues this idea of full transparency is impossible, tyrannical, and it's very much tied to totalitarianism. This idea that you can become fully aware and know the laws of history and have direct knowledge and understanding of where it's headed. Right. I mean, there's no such thing as, full self-transparency. So I tend to think that part of the reason he's so averse to this term is because of the ties that it has to the Praxis school in particular. I forgot the other thing that I was going to say because, that's who I am.
That's all good.
What was the last thing you said, Mikey, though? Because I did.
Is it the existentialist thing?
Right. Okay. So I love that because, I studied and read, Žižek's, up till probably Ticklish Subject before I first read Frederick Jameson's Marxism and Form. And what was so interesting to me was that when when you get to the chapter on Jean-Paul Sartre in Marxism and Form, the way that Jameson's explaining Sartre, I'm like, this is Lacan. I mean, there was so much in that I saw as Lacanian. And one of the things that I like about Sartre's writing in particular is the emphasis on freedom and on choice and freedom. Now, whereas, somebody who is, some kind of Lacanian, I just can't get past Sartre's dismissal of the Freudian unconscious.
That's where we're all at with him. Like, that's the core problem with Sartre.
And I think that this is, and so, I mean, but otherwise, I think the way that he emphasizes choice, I mean, it coincides for me in many ways with how Žižek reads the Cogito, and he does it. I've written about this in a few places, and I think I do in the book too, but how Žižek talks about how in Lacan, in the movement from Seminar 11 to Seminar 14, Lacan separates the cogito into the I think and the I am, and you have a choice, right? This is where the force comes in. Either you choose the I think or you choose the I am. And there's one part where Lacan says that we choose the I think and and then we lose the I am, we lose being. It's that part in, Seminar 11 on, your money or your life. He talks
Yeah.
about it. But then in Seminar 14, Zizek says, Lacan comes back to this and he says, yes, split the I think and I am. But what we do is we're condemned to the choice of the I am, and thought is relegated to the position of the unconscious. And what Zizek kind of does is he grafts these two decisions onto the Lacanian logics of sexuation, that the choice of being is on the masculine side of the universal exception, and that the choice of thought and the risking of being is part of the feminine form of sexuation. And what I think Zizek does with Lacan's four discourses and sexuation is kind of show how the hysterics discourse is part of this movement towards feminine sexuation. I like this way that Joan Kopchak in one place says that Lacan's Seminar 20, and Lacan says it too at the beginning, that he's in no way rewriting or rethinking parts of his ethics of psychoanalysis. And Kopchak takes this and argues that for Lacan, the ethical act is always feminine. It's not done by a woman necessarily, but that in the ethical act, we are occupying the feminine logic of sexuation. So that, when we talk about this moment of positing and negation and negation and negation in the Hegelian way that Zizek reads it, I read it very close as this movement from, a feminine hystericization towards the analyst discourse, of moving from the positing of presuppositions to the presupposing of the positing, that I know I was the one who created and posited the master signifier that got this logic started, and I go through all the representation only to come at the fact I was the one who posited it. I was the one, in the same way that in the analytical process, you start to come to realize that in that forced choice where we go towards the symbolic order and we negate the object that becomes the lost. I was the one who made the choice. I can put the blame onto all the other people. It was my parents who fucked me up, or it was the teacher, or it was, this asshole in the schoolyard, or this shithead colleague, right? Put all the blame. But ultimately, we're the ones who have the freedom to reposit the presuppositional signifier that gives structure to all of our way of thinking. And if you think about it in that sense, I think that there is something very existential, to the way in which, a Lacanian Hegelianism deals with ethical questions, to the extent that it does have to do with personal responsibility, in a certain way, right? That I have the freedom and the responsibility, and I can take the responsibility. And that, again, so in the way that I'm thinking of a dialectical humanism, a lot of it is about, okay, so we, if we want to deal with the conditions we have as human beings in the world, then it's our responsibility to take the helm. And I kind of say, because I don't believe in this, end of history type of scenario, that we're at the helm, we're steering, but we're always steering blindly, because we have to do what's necessary in every new historically contingent condition. But there's no guarantee ever that we're going to be successful. And history, is always understood retroactively. We look back on things, right? And we're moving forward, but we're always looking back, because that's the only thing that we can process, when we're acting in the world. So I agree. That's a long way of saying that I agree with you that, it is very existential. A lot of Zizek's writing, a lot of Lacanian, and, Todd, I think, will probably say that, there is sort of this implicit interaction with Sartre's work and a lot of Lacan.
Yeah, agreed. All right, well, this has been awesome. Before we close out, Nance, you got anything, reflections, thoughts?
One thing, I don't know. I think the thing that jumps out the most to me with the book, one thing we didn't get into, I didn't write it down anywhere, but I wanted to get into shift as opposed to rift. I think that's excellent, and I think it's actually very versatile. So I don't know, maybe we can have another conversation in the future and go in deeper on that. But the thing that jumps out the most to me is just I was made to feel my own complicity and my own guilt when reading this book in a good way, in a liberatory way. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's what our texts should do. They should turn the gaze back on the reader, and I think you accomplish that. And I think that's what's needed for the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I appreciate. I really hope that it's not just guilt, but I do want it to be. I hate the way people use this term. Like a call to action, right? The only action that I want people to take, though, is I think more critical thinking. More reflection on a lot of the quick and easy frameworks that people apply to very complicated and difficult situations. I think, this is why I agree with Žižek when he says that we have to flip around Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Feuerbach, many people will know, says that Marx, that's where I'm at. Marx says, in his theses, the philosophers have only thought about the world in many different ways. The point is to change it. And Slavoj likes to say instead, everybody everywhere is trying too quickly to change the world. We have to stop and we have to start thinking about it. And I think that that's what we need, more of today, that we have to, question, we have to think, not just what we perceive as a power that opposes us, but any, true Marxist, and I'm not one of them, but any true Marxist will tell you that it's necessary. Self-criticism is what's always, necessary first and foremost, and that there is no practice without theory.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we thank you for being here. Huge congratulations on the book. It's one that we're going to be reading for many years to come. And we'd love to have you back. There's so many more questions we had, and maybe sometime down the road we can go into those questions and go into some more general topics. So thank you for being here, Matt. It's awesome.
Well, we'll call this part 1, because part 2, I really, really want to talk about Posadism.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, that's another one that I wanted to get. And like I said, man, I felt seen, I felt heard when reading the book.
Okay, good. You feel heard, so I can be invisible. That's when I'll true subjectivity.
There it is.
Okay.
All right, Nance, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys. I really had a lot of fun.
Awesome. Let's do this again sometime.